The dining room glowed with soft candlelight, polished silverware reflecting tiny sparks that shimmered like stars across the mahogany tables. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between guests, their movements practiced, graceful, almost invisible. The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a sanctuary of wealth and power, the kind of establishment where a glass of wine cost more than most people's monthly groceries, where laughter echoed with entitlement, and where the world of the privileged seemed untouchable. At the center of the stage sat Edward Harrington, a man whose name opened doors before he even entered the room. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad with the posture of someone who had always been in command. His silver hair was slicked back with the precision of a man who paid attention to appearances. A navy blue tailored suit hugged his frame, and the glow of his gold cufflinks caught every stray flicker of candlelight. His face, sharp and pale, carried the faint redness of someone who enjoyed his wine perhaps a little too much. Cold blue eyes scanned the room, always looking down, rarely sideways, never up. For Edward, the world was filled with two kinds of people, those who served him and those who envied him. Tonight, though, his carefully curated world would crack. At the far end of the room, moving with quiet discipline, was Marcus Green. He was in his mid-40s, a lean man whose posture told a different story from the wealthy patrons around him. His dark brown skin bore the sun's imprint, a life of work and resilience etched across his features. His face was weathered, strong cheekbones cutting against the dim lighting, a short, unkempt beard shadowing his jawline. His black hair was cropped close, though strands curled where sweat or time had taken their toll. He wore the simple uniform of the restaurant, a white shirt tucked into black trousers, a faded apron tied tight at the waist, and worn shoes that whispered across the polished floor. Marcus was a waiter, at least to those who didn't look closer. To the guests, he was invisible, someone who filled glasses, delivered food, cleared empty plates. To Edward, he was just another figure whose name wasn't worth learning. But beneath Marcus's calm exterior lived a mind sharpened by years of hunger. Not hunger for food, though that had once been true, but hunger for understanding, for knowledge, for a kind of freedom that couldn't be bought with money, but demanded discipline and perseverance. As Marcus set a glass of wine before Edward, the millionaire barely lifted his eyes. His lips moved into something resembling a thank you, though it sounded more like a command than gratitude. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd heard it before. He'd lived with worse. The night pressed on with the usual rhythm of clinking glasses, low conversation, and a quiet shuffle of staff weaving through the room. But somewhere in the middle of it all, a moment happened that neither man could have predicted. Marcus had paused for a breath near the corner of Edward's table, waiting for the next cue, when the whisper of inspiration struck. In his apron pocket rested an old ballpoint pen, the kind that often leaked ink, staining his fingers. On the counter nearby lay a folded napkin, and without quite realizing why, Marcus pulled the napkin free, smoothed it against the table's edge, and began to write. The pen scratched faintly against the fabric. Numbers, symbols, equations that flowed as though they'd been waiting inside him all day, eager to escape. His brow furrowed, his lips moved slightly as he calculated in silence, his entire being shifting from waiter to mathematician in an instant. His hand, callous from years of labor, moved with the precision of a scholar. It was as if the napkin had become his chalkboard, the candlelight his lamp, the restaurant his lecture hall. And it was in that exact moment that Edward Harrington looked up. His cold blue eyes landed on the napkin, on the crude stage where Marcus was composing something Edward couldn't quite understand. He blinked once, then again, his arrogance colliding with confusion. This wasn't what waiters did. They didn't scribble equations during service. They didn't furrow their brows like professors, lost in abstraction. They didn't carry the posture of someone wrestling with a theorem that could bend reality itself. Edward's laughter, sharp and dismissive, burst out. "What on earth are you doing?" he asked, his voice pitched loud enough to draw the attention of a few tables nearby. Marcus looked up slowly. His deep, intense eyes held Edward's gaze with a calmness that unsettled a man. "Solving a problem," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, deliberate. Edward smirked, leaning back in his chair. "A problem? You're a waiter. The only problem you should be solving is whether my steak needs more salt." A ripple of laughter broke out among the guests, seated nearby. Edward's friends, draped in expensive fabrics and dripping with jewelry, chuckled at the easy cruelty. They sipped their wine, entertained at Marcus's expense. But Marcus didn't retreat. He didn't crumble beneath their mockery. Instead, he turned the napkin slightly, as though the equations mattered more than their laughter, more than Edward's insult. Sometimes, he said, his tone even, the biggest problems aren't on the table. They're in the mind. For the first time that night, Edward's smirk faltered. He leaned forward, peering at the scribbles. Numbers stretched across the napkin. Complex, unfamiliar. He saw square roots, fractions, variables intertwined in ways he hadn't touched since his youth. And there at the heart of it was something undeniable: logic, precision, intelligence. The dining room seemed to pause. The laughter dimmed. Even the waiters slowed, sensing a shift. Edward's wine glass hovered midair, his hands stiff, his arrogance clashing with something he couldn't explain. For a man who believed money was the only currency of power, seeing brilliance unfold on a napkin in the hand of a waiter was disarming, almost humiliating. "You expect me to believe," Edward said, his voice low now, "that you could understand this? That you—" He stopped himself, but the unsaid word hung in the air. "You, a waiter. You, a black man." Marcus met his stare, unflinching. "I don't expect you to believe anything," he replied. "Truth doesn't need permission." The word struck harder than equations. Edward's face tightened, his thin lips pressing into a line. Around them, the room felt different, as if a fault line had opened beneath the polished floor. For once, Edward Harrington, the millionaire whose arrogance towered above all, didn't have the upper hand. That night wasn't just the beginning of a strange encounter. It was the spark of a story that would unravel everything Edward thought he knew about power, about intelligence, and about the people he had dismissed his entire life. Marcus folded the napkin gently, slipping it back into his pocket. Then, with the same quiet composure, he returned to his duties, leaving Edward in silence. But Edward's mind was no longer at ease. He couldn't stop replaying the image. The waiter, the napkin, the unshakable calm of a man who carried a world of knowledge in his head, hidden behind the guise of service. For Edward Harrington, the millionaire who thought himself untouchable, this was the first time in decades he had felt small, and it terrified him. The hush of the restaurant deepened as Edward Harrington leaned closer to the table. His cufflinks glinted faintly under the low chandelier light, but his mind was far from appearances now. He wasn't thinking about the tailored perfection of his suit or the brandy that swirled lazily in his glass. His entire focus had narrowed to the scrap of napkin that lay between him and the man who had just undone his certainty. Marcus, still in his patched hoodie, still standing like he was used to the weight of dismissal, waited. He didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't avert his eyes the way Edward expected. He stood with the stillness of someone who had fought harder battles than to stare across a white linen table. Edward cleared his throat. "You understand what this means?" Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. "Well, what means?" "This equation, these symbols. They're not the kind of puzzles people stumble across in passing. They're proprietary, confidential. My firm has been, well, let's just say the resources spent on this have been substantial. And you," Edward paused, his jaw clenching, "you wrote it out like you were sketching grocery notes." A ripple of interest passed through the restaurant. Waiters slowed their movements. Diners leaned discreetly closer. And in the far corner, a violinist nearly missed a note. Marcus's reply was calm, almost soft. "I didn't mean to stumble into your secrets. I just see patterns. That's all it is to me. Patterns and truths." Edward studied him for a long moment. His instincts, the ones that had guided decades of corporate conquest, buzzed with a mixture of alarm and fascination. If what he had just witnessed was genuine, if Marcus could see what his team of analysts could not, then the ground beneath him was shifting. But pride held him firm. "Do you have any idea what this problem represents?" Marcus shook his head. "To me, it was numbers, shapes, balance waiting to be found." Edward leaned back, folded his arms. For the first time that evening, his arrogance faltered. His cold blue eyes, always sharpened by superiority, now carried something else, recognition. He whispered, almost to himself, "Impossible." But Marcus heard. "Not impossible," he said quietly. "Just unseen." The words lingered in the air, heavy as the scent of roasted lamb drifting from a kitchen. Edward's fingers tightened around his brandy glass. His world, so carefully ordered, so meticulously defended, had just been invaded, not by rivals with wealth or power, but by a man society never counted, a man in a hoodie with tired shoes and steady eyes. The napkin between them had become more than a slip of paper. It was a mirror, reflecting truths Edward didn't want to face. And as Marcus turned slightly, as if preparing to walk away, Edward did something he had not done in years. He reached out, not for control, not for dominance, but for understanding. His hand pressed lightly against the napkin, anchoring it to the table. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp but strained. "What's your name?" Marcus looked at him, steady and unflinching. Marcus. A name delivered without apology, without explanation. Edward let it settle. He wasn't used to remembering the names of men like Marcus, but he knew this one would echo long after the brandy glass was empty. The restaurant, sensing the gravity of something unspoken, held its collective breath, and in that silence, the balance of power in the room had shifted forever. The night was not finished. It was only beginning. The waiter had barely cleared the brandy glasses when Edward Harrington rose from his chair. His movements, usually crisp and commanding, were slower now, weighed down by a storm of calculation in his mind. He reached for his jacket, but not to leave. He wanted Marcus to follow. "Walk with me," Edward said, his tone curt, a command more than an invitation. Marcus hesitated. The restaurant's warmth wrapped around him like a fragile shield. The soft lighting, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversations. Outside was different. Outside was cold, unpredictable, sharp at the edges of the world Marcus knew too well. Still, he nodded. All right. The two men stepped out of the restaurant's doors and into the night. The city's pulse was immediate. The blur of headlights, the hiss of passing tires on damp pavement, the neon signs bleeding their colors into the mist. Edward's polished shoes clicked confidently against the sidewalk, while Marcus's worn sneakers barely made a sound. They walked side by side, though the distance between them felt like the space between two planets. For a block, they didn't speak. Edward's thoughts raced. What if this man really does see the structures my analysts have missed? What if he's the key to everything I've been chasing? And worse, what does that say about me, about the people I've chosen to trust? Finally, Edward broke the silence. Do you work? Marcus let out a dry laugh. Depend what you call work. Day jobs come and go. Construction, moving boxes, fixing things nobody else wants to fix. People don't see the rest of it. They don't want to. And the rest? Edward pressed. The numbers, the patterns. I see them everywhere. In buildings and broken radios, in the way traffic lights change. It's like the world is always whispering equations, and I just listen. Edward's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to hearing genius described with such simplicity. In his world, brilliance was commodified, bought, patented, hidden in vaults of corporate secrecy. Marcus was describing it like it was rainwater, falling freely if one only opened their hands. They reached the mouth of an alley, dimly lit. The hum of a flickering sign overhead. Edward stopped. He turned, facing Marcus directly, his cold blue eyes searching the man's weathered face. Do you know what men like me do with people like you? Marcus didn't flinch. His voice was steady. I've got a pretty good idea. Edward allowed a thin smile. We use you. We bury you in contracts. We chew you up until nothing is left but what we can profit from. That's how the world works. That's how I work. Marcus's eyes glinted in the shadow. And yet, here you are, talking to me instead of buying another drink. Edward's smile faltered. It was true. Something about this man had cracked through his armor. Why aren't you afraid of me? Edward asked suddenly, his voice low, dangerous. Marcus took a step closer, his face caught in the half-light. The hoodie hung loose, frayed at the sleeves, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. Because I've lived with worse than you. Fear doesn't feed me. Truth does. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two worlds colliding under the hum of a dying streetlight. Then Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Embossed, sleek, weighty in its simplicity. He held it out. My office. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Don't be late. Marcus looked at the card but didn't take it. His hands stayed at his sides. What happens if I don't show? Edward's gaze hardened. Then you'll have wasted the only chance you'll ever get to step out of the shadows. Marcus studied him. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached out and took the card. His fingers were rough against the smooth surface, and in that brief exchange both men knew something irreversible had just begun. The city buzzed around them, indifferent to the shift in fate that had occurred beneath its neon glow. Marcus slipped the card into his pocket. I'll think about it. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into dark like smoke dissolving into night air. Edward watched him go, a strange unease rising in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't know if he found a pawn, or a rival who might one day bring his empire crashing down. The mist thickened, the streetlights hummed. The night swallowed both men in different directions, carrying them toward collision neither could yet see. Equals 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 equals. The days after the restaurant encounter moved strangely for Marcus. He clocked in, tied his apron, carried trays, but the weight of Edward Harrington's stare lingered like a shadow at his back. Even the simplest tasks, pouring a glass of water, clearing plates, felt charged, as though invisible eyes were measuring him. By the third night, his manager approached with an odd request. Marcus, he said, fidgeting with his tie. Mr. Harrington's office called. He's invited you to a private dinner. Marcus froze. Invited me? Yes, at his estate. Formal. Tonight. The manager's nervous glance made clear what he wasn't saying. Don't refuse. Marcus hesitated. His instincts screamed caution. Men like Harrington didn't invite waiters into their world. They bought, they commanded, they discarded. Invitations weren't part of their vocabulary, but curiosity and something deeper, sharper, stirred in Marcus's chest. This was no accident. He agreed. That evening, Marcus stood before Harrington's mansion, its towering iron gates swinging open with mechanical precision. The driveway curved like a silver ribbon, lined with trimmed hedges and stone fountains spitting water under golden lights. His hoodie and jeans felt like armor, a reminder of who he was, and who he refused to pretend to be. A butler led him into a dining hall, where Edward Harrington waited alone. The millionaire was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, cufflinks glinting under the chandelier. A long table stretched between them, but Harrington motioned Marcus closer. Sit, Edward said, his tone controlled. Curious rather than hostile, Marcus lowered himself into the velvet chair, steady, unflinching. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Edward leaned forward, sliding a familiar napkin across the table, the one Marcus had scribbled on at the restaurant. Tell me, Harrington said quietly, how does a man like you solve problems my analyst can't? Marcus held his gaze. Because I don't see walls where you see them. A flicker crossed Harrington's face. Irritation, then intrigue. He swirled the wine in his glass, studying Marcus like a specimen under glass. You intrigue me, Marcus, he admitted. But intrigue is dangerous. It makes me ask questions. Questions you'd be wise to answer carefully. Marcus leaned back, unafraid. Maybe you're asking the wrong ones. For the first time in years, Edward Harrington smiled, thin, sharp, and dangerous. This was no dinner. It was a test, and Marcus had just accepted it. The grand dining room stretched wide like a cathedral of wealth. Chandeliers of Venetian crystal hung from the ceiling, refracting light into a million shimmering fragments that painted the walls in hues of gold. The table itself gleamed with a polish so deep Marcus could see his reflection staring back at him in distorted fragments. Edward Harrington stood at the head of the table, his tailored navy suit blending seamlessly with the leather-backed chair behind him. He looked every inch the master of this domain, his cold blue eyes fixed on Marcus, as though he were appraising not a guest, but a specimen. "Sit," Harrington commanded, not unkindly, but with the tone of a man who had grown accustomed to obedience. Marcus lowered himself into the seat opposite, his old hoodie and worn jeans looking like intruders against the silken sheen of the room. A servant glided forward, young, silent, efficient, placing silver domes before them. The scents that rose when the covers were lifted were rich, decadent. Roasted duck, truffle cream, caviar on ice. Marcus swallowed. He had eaten plain rice that morning. Edward raised a glass of red wine, swirling it so the liquid caught the chandelier's light. "To chance encounters," he said. Marcus nodded, but didn't lift the crystal glass before him. His hand stayed folded, steady, his dark brown eyes fixed on Edward. "You don't drink?" Harrington asked, his tone tinged with curiosity. "Not tonight," Marcus replied. "I need a clear head." That answer made Edward's eyebrow twitch upward. The arrogance that usually flowed like a river behind his every gesture stalled for just a second. He wasn't used to hearing no. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The clinking of cutlery on porcelain was the only sound. The weight of the room pressed on Marcus, but he refused to shrink. He took his bite slowly, savoring every crumb, every morsel, but never letting the food distract him from the man watching him. Finally, Edward leaned back, wiping his mouth with a cloth napkin. "Do you know why I invited you here?" he asked. Marcus shook his head. "To test me." A smirk ghosted across Edward's lips. "Smart. Most people would have said, because you're generous." "You don't strike me as the type to hand out charity," Marcus said flatly. Edward's smile broadened, though his eyes grew colder. "You're right. I don't. But you intrigue me, Marcus. Do you know how rare that is?" Marcus met his stare, without flinching. "I don't care about rarity. I care about truth." That line struck Edward harder than Marcus expected. The billionaire's hand paused over his wine glass, his jaw tightening before he relaxed again. "You presume to know me?" Edward asked, voice calm but edged like steel. "I don't presume," Marcus replied, "but I've lived long enough to see masks. You wear one. Money stitched it together for you, but it still cracks if you look close." The room went still. Even the servant in the corner seemed to freeze in place, as if sensing the air thicken with tension. Edward chuckled, low and slow. "You're either very brave, Marcus, or very foolish." "Maybe both," Marcus said. Silence fell again, but it was no longer empty. It thrummed, alive, heavy with an electricity neither man could name. Then Edward leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me something, Marcus. What do you want out of life? Men like you, men who scrape by, you all have dreams. But most of those dreams rot before they ever take shape. Tell me yours." Marcus felt the weight of the question. The truth pressed against his chest, raw and aching. He wanted to say stability, dignity, enough to ensure no one could step on him again. But instead, he leaned forward and answered with measured calm. "I want to be seen," Marcus said. "Truly seen, not judged by clothes or address or the weight of my wallet. I want people to know the man beneath all that. That's my dream." Edward stared at him, silent for a long time. The arrogance drained slightly from his face, replaced by something else, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even envy. The billionaire finally broke the silence with a laugh, sharp and dismissive. "Seen? My God, Marcus, that's a fool's dream. People don't see. They consume. They use. They discard. That's the world." Marcus didn't blink. "Maybe, but even if one person sees, really sees, that's enough." For the first time, Edward had no retort. His lips parted, then pressed shut. His fingers tapped against the glass, restless. Marcus realized then, beneath the wealth, beneath the arrogance, Edward Harrington was haunted by something, and Marcus had just touched it. The dinner ended not with triumph or defeat, but with an uneasy truce. Edward stood, his face unreadable, and extended his hand. "Come back tomorrow," he said simply. Marcus shook it, his palm rough against Edward's manicured fingers. As he left the mansion that night, Marcus felt a chill that wasn't from the night air. He had stepped into Edward's world, and neither of them would leave it unchanged. The morning after the gala, the city's newspapers were already buzzing with the story. Headlines screamed across the front pages. Millionaire brought to his knees by waiter's genius. Racism, redemption, and a napkin equation. Who really holds the future of science? The photo that made the rounds was unforgettable. Edward Harrington, the towering millionaire with his slick-back silver hair, leaning forward with stunned expression, while Jamal sat across from him in a waiter's uniform, a napkin full of calculations resting between them. It was more than a picture. It was a symbol. Edward Harrington hadn't slept that night. He tossed and turned in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the glittering skyline, haunted by the way his arrogance had been exposed in front of hundreds of people. He had built his fortune on deals, mergers, and power. He had never been the one caught off guard. Yet now, one man with a pen and a napkin had unraveled his pride in seconds. By sunrise, he sat at his mahogany desk, sipping black coffee, staring at Jamal's name on his phone. He hadn't dialed yet. He couldn't. His pride was still raw, torn between anger and awe. Meanwhile, Jamal's world had changed overnight. The restaurant manager, once skeptical of Jamal's dreamer attitude, now looked at him like a celebrity. Guests whispered when he passed their tables. Some asked for photos. Others pressed business cards into his hand. But Jamal wasn't thinking about fame. He was thinking about the numbers, about how the equation that had silenced a room of millionaires might actually change the way scientists approach renewable energy. The napkin wasn't just ink on paper. It was possibility. And with possibility came responsibility. That week, Jamal was invited to universities, think tanks, and even late-night TV shows. He turned down most offers, focusing instead on his work. Still, he knew he couldn't hide forever. One evening, he received a call that made him stop in his tracks. It was Edward Harrington. "Jamal," Edward's voice was low, almost gravelly. "We need to talk. Not about money, not about publicity, about what you started." There was a pause. Jamal let him wait before answering. "What I started, or what you almost destroyed." The line was silent for a moment, and Jamal could almost hear the weight of the words pressing against Edward's pride. Finally, Edward spoke. "Both." Their meeting took place in a quiet library instead of a boardroom. Edward had chosen the place carefully. No cameras, no crowd, just shelves of books and two men on opposite sides of a polished oak table. Edward wore his usual tailored navy blue suit, but his cold blue eyes carried something new: humility. He leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly, as though holding himself together. "Do you realize what you did that night?" Edward asked. Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Solve an equation on a napkin?" "No," Edward said sharply. "You changed the conversation. You made men like me stop and listen. That doesn't happen often." Jamal folded his arms, unimpressed. "And what exactly do you want from me, Edward?" Edward hesitated. Then he admitted something he'd never said before. "I want to help you." For Jamal, trust wasn't something easily given, but he also understood power, and Edward still had plenty of it. Together, they could turn his napkin calculation into something bigger. But Edward's offer came with conditions, and Jamal wasn't sure if they were conditions he could accept, because in the end, this wasn't just about math. It was about dignity. It was about truth. It was about rewriting the script of who gets to be heard and who gets ignored. And as Jamal looked Edward in the eyes across the library table, he realized something. This wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The library air was heavy with silence, the kind that stretches between men who both know the stakes are higher than they seem. Jamal sat with his arms folded, a quiet storm simmering inside him. Edward Harrington, the man who once looked down on him like a speck of dust, now leaned forward, desperate to be heard. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about power. And for the first time in his life, Edward Harrington wasn't sure he still had it. The offer. Edward's voice broke the stillness. You've built something bigger than yourself, Jamal. That napkin wasn't just ink. It was a blueprint, a door, and whether you like it or not, the world is already reaching for the handle. Jamal smirked, unimpressed. Funny, when I was just a waiter, you didn't care what I had to say. Edward didn't flinch. He was a man used to arrogance. But his own words had cut him before. He swallowed his pride. I was wrong. The words hung in the air like a confession. Edward's cold blue eyes, once filled with disdain, now carried something Jamal never expected to see in him. Humility. Jamal leaned forward, his deep brown eyes steady. And what does being wrong mean in your world, Edward? An apology? A headline? A handshake in private, while you keep your money, and I go back to bussing tables? Edward's jaw tightened. No, it means partnership. It means I put my resources, my network, my influence behind your work. We could take your equation from a napkin to the global stage. You could change energy as we know it. I can help you if you'll let me. The dilemma. Jamal felt his chest tighten. For years, men like Edward have been the gatekeepers, the ones who decided which voices mattered, who got funding, who was silenced. Now Edward was offering a seat at the table. But Jamal wasn't sure if the table itself wasn't poisoned. Why me? Jamal asked flatly. Edward looked down at his cufflinks. Gold, polished, perfect. Then back up, because the world doesn't listen to me anymore. Not the way it used to. They see greed, arrogance, corruption. But you're the voice they didn't expect. The voice that shook a room full of men like me. If you take this path, they'll follow. Jamal studied him, his silence deliberate. He thought of Angela Brooks, the woman who had once been humiliated beside Edward on that flight. He thought of Marcus, the man on the street whose dignity had been stolen by men in suits. He thought of every face he'd passed as a waiter, faces that were invisible to power until someone forced the world to see them. Do you want to help me? Jamal asked slowly. Or do you just want to save yourself? Edward hesitated, and in that pause lay the truth. Both, he admitted. The decision. Days turned into weeks as Jamal wrestled with the offer. Reporters still hounded him. Scholars wanted to dissect his work. Investors dangled contracts like bait. But Jamal stayed quiet, buried in chalkboards and journals, working the math until his fingers cramped. The equation wasn't finished. The napkin was only a seed. And if he let Edward into the soil, he had to be sure the roots wouldn't strangle him. One night, exhausted, Jamal walked the city streets. Neon lights reflected in puddles, and a hum of traffic wrapped around him. He passed by a diner window where a young boy sat, scribbling numbers on his homework while his mother worked a double shift. That boy reminded him of himself. Hungry, invisible, dreaming. And Jamal knew then, this wasn't just about him. If he turned Edward down, the system would swallow him whole. If he accepted, he could bend that system, maybe even break it. So he made his choice. The partnership. The press conference was standing room only. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded the stage, and the hum of anticipation filled the hall. Jamal stepped up first, wearing a crisp white shirt, no tie, no suit. He didn't need one. His presence was enough. Beside him stood Edward Harrington in his tailored navy suit, shoulders squared, face carved into stone. But this time, he wasn't leading. He was following. Jamal spoke into the microphone. Months ago, I was a waiter. To most people, that meant I was invisible. But invisibility doesn't mean insignificance. It means overlooked potential. I wrote an equation on a napkin that night, and suddenly the world listened. But here's the truth. There are thousands of voices like mine. Voices ignored, dismissed, or silenced because of where they come from or what they look like. Today, that ends. The crowd erupted in applause. Jamal raised his hand for silence. This equation isn't mine alone. It belongs to every kid told they weren't good enough. Every parent who sacrificed so their children could dream. Every worker who clocked in at midnight and still found time to study by morning. And yes, Edward Harrington will support this project. But this isn't about him. It's about us. about building a future that doesn't ask who you are before it asks what you can do. Edward stood stiff beside him, his lips pressed tight. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the headline. He was a footnote, and strangely, he accepted it. The legacy, years later, people would still talk about the napkin equation. They would teach it in classrooms, reference it in boardrooms, and hang that iconic photo in museums. But the true legacy wasn't the math, it was a shift. The moment a waiter stood taller than a millionaire, and the world had no choice but to listen. Edward Harrington's empire changed too. His name no longer symbolized arrogance alone, but also transformation. He had bent, reluctantly, imperfectly, but he had bent towards something better. And Jamal? He didn't just change energy, he changed expectation. He became proof that brilliance doesn't wear a uniform, that genius doesn't check a bank account, that dignity doesn't need permission. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions don't begin in laboratories or boardrooms. Sometimes they begin on a napkin,